Welcome back, everybody. Left Reckoning. We're really excited and honored to be joined today by Matt T. Huber, who's a professor of geography in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, who just came out with this really wonderful book, Climate Change is Class War, spiffy cover as well. Thank you so much, Matt.
A starkly graphic design. I like it.
Thank you so much, Matt, for hanging out with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think we can just jump right into it. I mean, rightfully so. Like, we talk about climate change a lot. It's a damn pressing problem. Yeah. But I get worried because sometimes I think, especially the left gets so caught up in like, okay, well, we need to believe the science and we just need to do something, that oftentimes I think we forget, one, how can we build movements? And two, what exactly are we going to do? And I really find your book to be an antidote to that in many ways. But maybe to start us off, I really like how you reinsert production into the climate question.
Yeah.
And could you maybe like juxtapose, what you can roughly call like a consumption-based approach to climate politics versus a class one?
Well, interestingly, there's a class analysis that focuses on consumption, that in a really, I think, impoverished and narrow way. So if you look around in academia and much of the, like mainstream press, you'll hear a constant talk about climate change as a problem of inequality, like in the Thomas Piketty sort of sense that there's a lot of rich people and there's a lot of poor people and the gap is widening. And that all that analysis kind of does this sort of carbon footprint analysis of people's what are called lifestyle consumption-based footprints. So what you do in your everyday life, you eat some steak, you drive a car, you sort of add up all that consumption, and you get a sort of footprint of however many pounds of carbon. And this has just become the way everyone thinks about climate impacts. They think the worst thing that rich people do is they is in their consumption world, with like yachts and private jets. But as we know, as socialists, like that vision of class is very superficial. It's about people's income and their consumer practices. And socialists like to focus on the relationship to production, to the means of production. And it really struck me that this is a really useful, just like the most basic old school socialist way of thinking about class is a really useful way of looking at the climate crisis, because really, like in a lot of ways, this movement or struggle is really over how we produce everything. At the core of it is energy. But if you start looking at energy is an input to everything else. And so it's it's a system of industrial production that we're going to have to fundamentally transform. And, like that's what socialist and working class movements were always about, to sort of struggle over seizing, if you will, the means of production, seizing industrial production for the working class. And so this kind of old socialist sort of class analysis focused on production is really useful way to think about the climate crisis. And then moreover, if you start thinking about class in this way, focused on production, but also like ownership, like who owns production, who's profiting from production, then you really are going to look at it way differently than this, God bless him, Thomas Piketty, like inequality carbon footprint way, because you're not going to look at people's consumptive activities. You're going to look at, well, how did they get all the money that allowed for that consumption in the first place? Maybe they're a CEO of a fossil fuel company, and they spend their days like organizing this big productive system to churn out fossil fuels for profit, and that's how they make all their money. And then maybe they drive a Hummer on the side, but that's like a drop in the bucket compared to their like what they're doing to make the money. And then also when you start to think about like, wait a minute, like when we consume gasoline or when we consume natural gas to heat our homes, like we're not the only ones involved in that transaction. There's other owners, there's other producers who provision that consumption and are profiting off of it. And somehow the whole carbon footprint methodology like erases those owners and makes it you, the consumer, 100% responsible for emissions, and it just sort of erases capitalist ownership, who's profiting from this, and that's those people are the real ones who are responsible. And then finally, if you just look at a very basic sort of understanding of where emissions are coming from and and what are the most sort of emission intensive parts of the economy, it's also industrial production. It's something crazy, like just steel and cement. The production of steel and cement is something like 15 to 20% of global carbon emissions right there. In the book, I do a case study of the nitrogen fertilizer industry, which is a massive carbon intensive production system. And then if you look at a sort of global level, industrial production is responsible for about 34% of emissions, which is higher than all the other categories that you would look at, like transportation or residential heating and agricultural land use, these other categories. So from all these different angles, like it's clear the real issue here is industrial production, and we need to build a movement that can kind of take control over that system to rapidly transition away from a fossil fuel based mode of production. So.
Yeah, you have a really good section on the air travel in general. And with this line, carbon guilt confuses material privilege, a level of comfort and security, with the power to control the material organization of energy production. You might feel privileged to fly on a plane, but the airline industry gains the profit from your privilege.
Exactly. And that passage comes from me being in this somewhat hellscape of academia where, man, all these academics they think that their flights and their flying, they think higher education is like this really carbon intensive sector. It's really not, but they're just so torn up about the flying that they have to do for conferences and research and whatever. And they've set up websites and petitions, and there's this hashtag Fly Less campaign and it's all about, changing academics' behavior at the consumption level. And no one ever brings up aviation capital, like the people actually profiting from the system. It's just erased from this whole discourse. So.
Well, I mean, like a lot of like the modern climate movement is all about decisions, but they're sort of leaving out one of the biggest decision makers, which is, the capitalist class and the people who are profiting off of this system. Before we get to that class of folks, I mean, let's talk about the climate movement just a bit, because you make the argument that so much, particularly of like the American climate movement, comes out of, this kind of PMC or professional managerial class politics of, guilt. Could you talk a little bit about that development, what its effects are, and most importantly, how their relationship to production affects their politics in general, and more specifically, their climate politics?
Yeah. So the first thing is like the whole class project of the PMC or the professional class is to try to, in the context of, again, Thomas Piketty, like a widening inequality in this sort of barbaric capitalist system. The class project is to try to marshal credentials of some kind, like degrees and licenses, to carve out an advantage in the labor market and to attain some level of middle class security. And that class project then runs into a contradiction when you become more aware and invested in climate politics, because that very middle class security, which is at the heart of your class project, becomes embedded in these practices like owning a car, maybe a single family home in the suburbs, or flying for your professional academic conferences or whatever. And so those so-called high carbon lifestyle practices become a source of guilt and anxiety for the professional class. And so therefore their politics kind of does channel that guilt towards like an inward looking, moralistic politics over lifestyle changes and the need to lower your carbon footprint and stuff like that. But the other way of looking at the professional class and the rise of the professional class is it's happening And actually, Barbara and John Ehrenreich are really mapping how this dynamic is sort of affecting like the new left and political movements in the 60s and 70s, as you get this skyrocketing of higher education and more and more people going into higher education, and again, using that to try to carve out advantages in the labor market. But you also, alongside that, have obviously the assault on the industrial working class. You have widespread deindustrialization, and you have a real, class war against kind of that blue collar industrial working class that had built up so much power from the 1930s onward. And so you sort of have the decline of the industrial working class with the rise of this kind of professional class that's sort of working in what we call the knowledge economy, which is by its very definition, separated from this core issue of climate, which is industrial production. And so for the professional class, there's this kind of distance from the industrial system, and it's a very different type of class position than that good old industrial proletariat that's like doing the work in the factories, that's organizing in the factories to try to, again, wrestle control over these productive systems. And so for the professional class, I think they really kind of see industrial production as purely this kind of thing out there that's bad and harmful and doing bad things to communities and the environment. And sort of their analysis is always just sort of pointing out the harms but it's a very different approach to socialism traditionally, which is really not necessarily saying that industrial production's bad, that it's bad when it's controlled by capitalists, but it actually, if we could harness it for our own class, we could actually use the gains of industrial production to kind of create the conditions for human liberation and automation and all this kind of stuff. So you just get a very different relationship to production when you're coming from that knowledge economy in the professional class.
And you note in the book, which I think was just an astute point, that like when you get a lot of these, at least in like American left circles, like criticisms of like consumerism, right? A lampooning of American consumerism is happening in the 70s. And what's happening for the working class at this period of time is just like an all-out class war against them. They're actually starting to see their standards of living declining. When it is this kind of class that's sort of outside of that world that is then starting to get very holy and worried spiritually about, how many cheeseburgers people are eating and things like that, as people are getting fired and their unions are being busted.
Right. And this is what Barbara, not to bring them up constantly, Barbara and John Ehrenreich, what they identified with this rising kind of PMC was this kind of contempt for the masses and for the working class, and this sort of moral superiority that they felt like through education we can kind of like understand the real battles, and that again, one thing I try to repeat over and over again is that there's really nothing wrong with professional intellectual people being part of left movements or socialist movements. I mean, obviously you look at when socialist politics was most powerful, you had a whole cadre of highly educated people, notwithstanding Marx himself, Lenin, these people were highly PMC-ified, right? So, but they were able to use, their backgrounds to kind of try to build a broader working class politics that helped build it and helped build through the working class. So the problem is when, as Barbara and John Ehrenreich point out, when you sort of are setting out a politics that's actively antagonistic to the working class and kind of, again, showing contempt toward them, that's where you can run into problems. And that's what I see in a lot of climate politics. It's very much this kind of moral superiority over this, these masses who eat their cheeseburgers, drive their cars, and go to Texas Roadhouse or whatever it is. Like, there's just this sort of moral superiority that's not going to help you build a mass working class movement at all, right?
And well, before we get to like, just so people know, we're going to get to some of the things that we can do, and like this isn't just one big criticism of environmentalism at large. Like this is important. We want to reduce emissions and come up with a solution to this. But before we get there, apart from just like the kind of PMC left, I think it's worthwhile to also talk about the kind of neoliberal or like liberal climate movements, which basically sort of treat climate change like the problem as it's a problem of market forces not being correct, and that if we could just correct the market forces, that would be a solution to climate change. Could you give us a bit of the socialist critique to that kind of logic?
Well, I have to thank old Karl Marx again for this one, because if you read Capital, like his whole point is like classical political economists are obsessed with exchange and the prices in the market at the surface, and that to understand capitalism, you really need to go deeper into the hidden abode of production to see where class struggle. And I was seeing the same thing, like in the climate, I call them policy technocrats, these kind of policy wonky people who think we can kind of use market forces to solve the problem. They are totally only looking at exchange and the market system and the price system as something that can just be corrected through a carbon tax or through carbon pricing. The economists say it's like, even Milton Friedman would agree that this is like a market failure, that emissions are not taken, like the cost of emissions aren't taken into account in the prices of commodities. So you just have to correct for that and internalize the cost into the prices by a carbon tax, or there's these other complicated things called cap and trade that are just a nightmare. But these kinds of market-based policies will basically create through the price system incentives that will seamlessly guide entrepreneurs to invest in clean energy away from fossil fuel energy. And this has been the theory that like we really don't need to confront the power of the fossil fuel industry. We just need to get the prices right and allow the market to sort of, again, seamlessly transition to the promised land. But the problem is that there's a lot of problems. But for one, like these, as you probably got from what I was just explaining, essentially what these policies mean is we want to internalize the cost, which means to raise the price of energy ultimately. And people don't like that, as we're seeing right now. The masses of people don't respond well to huge spikes in energy costs, but also the anti-climate right wing is very easily able to take these policies and say, look, these liberals are trying to scheme to make the price of energy more and make your life worse and make your life cost more. I quote Charles Koch basically making this argument, like he's concerned about the poor pay a third of their income to energy, and this is going to hurt the poor. He's really looking out for the poor.
Yeah, Koch.
Good friend of the poor's. And so these policies fall right into the right's lap as an easy way to kind of build a kind of populist backlash to climate policy. And the other thing is they're just, even without the right villainizing these types of policies, they're just not popular on their own merits. The state of Washington, which is pretty liberal, Democratic leaning state, they tried to pass a carbon tax in 2016 and 2018, failed by sizable margins both times. And what's really funny is that these policy technocrats, they actually think that by making these free market policies, they can actually win over the Republicans, win over the right to like good climate policy. And this organization, I hate to mention them, but I bring them up in the book, called the Citizens Climate Lobby. They set up this little wonky policy called the carbon fee and dividend that would redistribute the fee to households through a dividend. But they are very insistent to call it a revenue neutral policy, which means the fee will not grow government, is how they frame it. And they think that that will help them get Republican support, because we all know Republicans don't want to grow government. But anyone that's looking at the climate crisis knows it's going to take a whole shit ton of public investment and a whole lot of growing government, essentially. And so they're trying to win over this mythical climate supporting Republican and it's obviously not working. And so these, it's just very hopeless. And the Citizens Climate Lobby has a slogan called "We're going to outsmart climate change." And this is where the professional class thing comes in. It's like we're so smart, we can design these really logical, rational policies that will just like fix the market, and it's going to work. And it still has not worked. And then whenever people have been able to pass something like a carbon tax, you see what happens, like in France, where the Yellow Vest movement, you get a mass working class revolt because people don't want to see their energy costs rise, even if they're seeing some sort of weird dividend that comes later. They don't like raising the price of energy because climate change is not going to win people over. It's not a great strategy at all.
Well, it's certainly not a majoritarian strategy. And like, I grew up poor in the South. I live in a working class neighborhood in my hometown now, and I talk to my neighbors all the time about this stuff. And I will always remind folks that first of all, most of the people I know just don't vote, but they're also very wary of things because they've noted in their life that when politics comes into their life, usually things are about to get worse, not better. And we'll break down some of the ways that we can flip that in a second, but. One of the things that you noted in a piece you wrote a little while ago called "Climate Doom Won't Save the Planet," too, is that banks have poured $3.8 trillion into fossil fuels in recent memory, and those banks expect a return on that investment, right? So thinking that even in this best case scenario where you're able to get the tax increase, carbon taxing, right? There is not the incentive, even within the market, for there to be less fossil fuel production from all the people and all the organizations that are invested in this process.
Yeah. I mean, I critique him somewhat in the book, but Bill McKibben has done some good work in just showing how many gigatons of fossil fuel still remain in the earth and how much the fossil fuel industry is counting on banking in on that and that investment. And we're seeing now, like, again, just with Ukraine and with inflation, it's just like climate change is just off the table, and it's back to kind of fossil fuel production gone wild, and oil, gas, and coal firms are seeing just windfall profits right now. And one of the real issues that we're facing is that we keep just thinking like the market will solve this, but like if we keep leaving it to the market, this is what happens. You get windfall profits for the very industries that we need to transition away from. And it's so clear, it should be so clear that we need to like take some sort of social control over this energy system to guide it towards where we need, but no one's willing to. It's just ideologically impossible to even contemplate that. Just like Pete Buttigieg said, like, there's no way government can produce this baby formula. Like, that's not allowed, right? It's the similar thing. It's just like, we're just going to let the world burn because we can't violate the property rights of private capital who control the energy system, and they're going to keep controlling it and profiting from the very energy that's burning the planet up and going to could make life uninhabitable for many humans in this century. So it's the way we just cede everything to capital in the market and act like we can't control it. It's depressing to me. As someone who has a 6-year-old girl.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, it's interesting though, like, just like talking about the, what the Russian invasion of Ukraine has meant for oil and gas. Like here in Texas, like, people don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there's any inclination in the oil and gas industry to slow down production. But to, at least in the short term, sort of lessen the price of gas, you actually haven't seen as much ramping up as you would expect. Now, there have been a lot of new permits that have been distributed, and those will certainly be used. But the point is that while all of these fossil fuel corporations are raking in profits right now, what are they doing with it? They're actually distributing it to their shareholders and their investors in the form of dividends. And the point here is not that, the fossil fuel corporations have gone woke and they're trying to keep the oil on the ground. It's that finance is the master of the beast. And until you start to deal with that master, you're not going to get close to dealing with this problem.
Right. There's, you've probably heard of BlackRock and they've been trying to set up what's called ESG investing, environment, social governance investing, where it's going to like the world of finance is going to try to make sure that all these firms are taking the risk of climate change into account, and we're going to not invest in fossil fuel projects and all this kind of stuff. A few months ago, a bunch of Texas energy firms and I think even elected representatives basically started a petition that basically accused Larry Fink of BlackRock of boycotting illegally the fossil fuel industry. And they were going to take action and just basically try to get all of these Texas entities out of BlackRock. And he freaked out and was just like, I just want to be clear. We like fossil fuels. Everything's fine. And it just shows like this is not the answer. Larry Fink and BlackRock are not going to save us.
Well, unless you had something, Matt, I was hoping to get to degrowth a little bit before we get to the more hopeful bit of the book, because I think I
think just maybe a little bit before degrowth, kind of to set the table for that, can you just go through the concept of ecology and how to sort of combine that with a Marxian class analysis?
Very nice. So ecology is essentially like the study of life and its webs of relations that make life possible. And obviously, typically, it's been used to study non-human ecosystems, like wolves and what the wolves eat and the plants that they rely on, like the web of life. And like we are animals, we're living beings within ecosystems, and so I think from a Marxist perspective, again, Marx is very clear that like humans have to produce and reproduce their material existence in a very kind of ecological way. But, unlike animals that really produce their subsistence directly through nature, like what humans do, that's really weird is we basically force all the humans off any guaranteed way to make a living off of nature. In other words, we dispossess the bulk of humans from the land, and through a process of enclosure, sort of privatizing the land, pushing all these people off of it. And this is a process Marx called proletarianization, of kind of turning peasants and other indigenous peoples and people that are rooted in the land, basically violently tearing them from the land to turn them into basically people that have nothing to sell but their labor power to survive on a market. And, again, you don't see that in nature. You don't see bears privatizing the means of fish production and forcing the other bears to work for wages to access the fish. And so the fact that we do this to humans creates this very weird ecological system where working class people have to sell their labor, work for money to access food commodities and other shelter commodities that they need to survive. So I call this a proletarian ecology, where it's really this fundamental insecurity of meeting your basic life needs, your basic ecological needs as a human, include healthcare in there, energy being a big one. And so that, and then the other side of that class analysis is there's a class of people that control the production of those core life needs, like energy and food and housing, and those people are profiting off those sectors while we have to work to get this just bare access to our lived needs. So anyway, I'll try not to go on too long, but like a lot of like people in the environmental NGO and academic community really talk about like environmental politics is really it's like something that is going to be something environmental that's like affecting someone's life, like toxic pollution or land dispossession or some sort of again like environmental threat to a community. And so there's a whole sort of focus on like environmental justice and these frontline communities that are like bearing the brunts of climate change and climate disasters. But that kind of focus on just like these material environmental threats doesn't really look at that broader proletarian ecology where most people's threat to their life is just the market itself. It's the fact they don't have enough money to get the things they need, and that they really are struggling to get by paycheck to paycheck. And that no one ever frames that life struggle as an environmental struggle, but it is, right? And if we actually start framing our climate or environmental politics that tries to appeal to those life struggles, the struggle to get by in a capitalist market, we actually might reach a much broader base of people that are struggling, because the environmental justice focus almost like by definition talks about how these poisoned communities are these marginalized communities, right? They're sort of like peripheral to the system, and they're the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most frontline. But it's a lot to expect these extremely oppressed and marginalized communities to be the ones that are going to build the power and build the movement to win again, to beat these capitalists who control the energy system. So it'd make much more sense to try to frame our environmental politics toward that proletarian insecurity, where you can reach people just, again, who are just struggling to get by. And it's very lucky that, the very sectors that people depend on in their lives, like food and energy and housing, are the things we need to decarbonize, are the things we need to transform. And instead of being those climate wonky people and saying we're going to internalize the prices and make stuff cost more, we say like we give you better access, or even decommodified access to these basic necessities of your life, which I think the Green New Deal was like a first cut at trying to sort of think about. I mean, Medicare for all is decommodified access to healthcare, but we could think about doing that for things like energy and public housing and maybe even food. But these are the sectors like that are at the core of the climate crisis. And if we tried to talk about material gains for the working class through those sectors, it would, I think, have more potential to build a broader base.
Yeah. And also, like, the Marxist like theory of change is not that like the proletariat is necessarily the most exploited or the most oppressed class that's ever existed in history. Exactly. Is that they have a very specific role in production that is crucial to it. And that's why if you can organize them, we can get pretty radical changes. And